I like the concept of telling stories through a game, which is probably why I gravitated toward Fire Emblem and RPGs in general, really, in the first place. Outside of my hobby-level experience with designing tabletop games and helping run small online role-playing games in the past for friends and strangers, like the nerd that I am, most of my experience with stories in games comes from playing them. And although there are limitations to storytelling in graphical games that you don't normally run into in, say, a text-based role-playing game or a book, I still enjoy seeing how other games do it. So when I was craving a new Fire Emblem story to play my way through, I naturally checked the list of romhacks on FE Universe. I tried going for something that seemed like not many people had played at all, at least not for YouTube, and I figured it'd be nice to do a let's play of a romhack with a shared focus on its story, as well as the gameplay challenges it offers. So after a bit of searching, I eventually found a romhack called the Dragon Herald by Big Mood, also known as Sigma Raven, and it really intrigued me. What grabbed my attention at first after downloading it was the README. It says, "The Dragon Herald is a personal exercise in talentlessness with two goals: to be completed with as little personal skill on the part of the developer as possible, by using community resources for everything, and to be entirely complete upon release. Theoretically, anyone could have made this game, which is a testament to the great strides in FEGBA hacking made by the community." The idea of a ROM hack that was designed to celebrate the ROM hacking community's progress over the years by showing what can be done with no real experience in ROM hacking is kind of heartwarming in its own way. After all, ROM hackers all have one thing in common. They love Fire Emblem enough to be inspired to create their own original stories in the context of a Fire Emblem-like game, modifications of games they love, and the creative spin-offs that feel familiar but bring unique concepts to the table. And I think that's a celebration worth appreciating. So I fired up the Dragon Herald and started playing it, and never looked back. As you're listening to or watching the review, if you become interested in checking out the Dragon Herald yourself, keep in mind that there's a link to the FE Universe posts for the ROM hack, which contains information as well as the download link. Also, as you're watching, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to my channel if you like this video. I don't only do ROM hack reviews, but also other forms of scripted videos, as well as streams, let's plays, challenge runs, and the like. Now to get into the review. Despite being a fan-made ROM hack, the Dragon Herald plays like an official Fire Emblem game. And to be clear, I think that's a good thing. One thing where the Dragon Herald differs from most Fire Emblem games is that it's locked to one difficulty setting. Usually when games do this, it's because the game is balanced around a specific difficulty, and any deviations from that would lead to an unintended experience. This can be a risk though, since if the game isn't balanced very well or the design isn't very intuitive to people used to playing Fire Emblem games, the game will be unplayable for most people. The Dragon Herald is fortunately very well balanced, considering that just one person was responsible for all of the gameplay design. Does it have a few rough patches? Sure, and I'll get into those in a bit, but overall the game feels good to play and doesn't suffer from being too hard or too easy, at least for me. I'd say someone who is more or less comfortable with the highest difficulties of all the GBA games will do just fine with the Dragon Herald. Although I wouldn't necessarily be against it if Big Mood added an easier difficulty setting for players who are not as proficient at playing Fire Emblem games, but are still interested in an easy experience that will allow them to primarily enjoy the story, which is a totally valid way to play a Fire Emblem game, or any video game in general, really. As for characters, I found that practically all of the members of the character roster more or less fit into familiar archetypes and serve similar functions that they would in a standard game, which helps a lot with establishing a certain level of familiarity from the get-go. The alternative, of course, is to build characters against a Fire Emblem player's reasonable expectations. Say, giving an Armor Knight bases similar to a vanilla Armor Knight, but giving them low growths in defense and strength and high growths in resistance and speed, or something silly like that. Connecting your fan game to some familiar archetypes is key to letting the player sink their teeth into your game immediately, and the Dragon Herald does exactly that. Some people might argue that this isn't terribly ambitious of the ROM hack creator, because there are resources like the skill system that could have been applied to make units stand out more, in a gameplay sense, or some sort of unique gameplay concept that applies to all characters somehow. I disagree with that. Complexity for its own sake doesn't typically work out very well, and can definitely lead to good idea but poor execution territory. I don't hate skills in Fire Emblem GBA ROM hacks, since ROM hackers tend to use the skill system fairly responsibly, in my experience, but I can understand why they weren't used in the Dragon Herald, and I think the game was designed well despite the skill system's absence. The ROM hack uses the tried and true method of making units stand out by giving them certain classes, base stats, and growth rates that give them certain applications in battle, and that's just fine. In lieu of adding entire new systems to the game, Big Mood still tweaked a few gameplay elements. Among the more notable changes are giving Iron, Steel, and Silver Bows 2-3 range, changing around tomes to better match the physical weapon triangle in terms of might and weight, and providing unique effects like a Brave Dark tome and a 2-3 range light tome, and a slew of class changes and rebalances. Overall, the changes trend toward making the Dragon Herald a little more player-phase focused than it already is, as they give your units a little more movement, the ability to use more things and attack from greater distances, and so on. Considering enemies in this game tend to be pretty offensively tough but lack good defenses, much like most of your own units do, these are pretty important changes. That said, some of the units felt a fair bit weaker than I would have liked them to be, especially considering their joining time and the relatively short length of the Romhack, roughly comparable to Sacred Stones. Although these kinds of units exist in official Fire Emblem games too. Late-game trainee units like Cassie, well, to be honest, they kinda suck, but that's fine. They might be fun to try to use, but it's ultimately not a big deal to have the player separate who they think the good units are from the bad units. In my opinion, the roster feels weakest compared to the enemy in the middle of the game, around chapters 7 to 13, although this can be something that likely varies based on personal experience. And if you like growth units, there are growth units aplenty in this hack. Pick one or two and favor them, and you will be rewarded for your efforts in training them, often in different ways. That said, I came away from this game thinking that some units could probably stand to be buffed at least a little bit, so that they feel a little less useless for their join times. I have a tier list video for this Romhack where I go into quite a bit more detail about this, discussing each playable unit and where I'd rate their viability compared to how much investment it takes to get those units in a good place. But the basic rundown is, a few units in this hack really stand out on their own as being solid additions to your party from the get-go, and most of the rest kinda feel like units dependent on growth. The benefit to this is that you can pick and choose your favorite characters and compose a solid team out of any of them. The downside is that a few unlucky level ups could lead to replacing characters with people you get a lot later. But given how high some characters' growths are in some areas, you can't really go wrong with any character in their important growth areas. On the subject of replacing characters, I feel like the Dragon Herald is best optimized around a style of play that keeps pretty much every character alive, at least until the endgame, especially characters that you've been using a lot. An Iron Man run of this game will probably fall apart quickly if you lose a unit you've invested a lot of experience into, due to the fact that anyone you could deploy to replace your fallen unit will likely be too low level to keep up with the very difficult enemies you start to face around chapter 7 or so. But there are a few key characters recruited in the mid and late game that'll help out here. I feel like the roughest part of an Iron Man is probably going to be the first 10 or so chapters of the game, but you should be smooth sailing if almost all of your characters are alive as of chapter 11. And you turtle through some of the more difficult chapters after that as much as possible. It would be interesting to actually try an Iron Man of this sometime, as well as a 0% growths run just to see what is doable sometime. I feel like it would be an interesting challenge. I would say the biggest challenge the Dragon Herald offers, the challenge that spans the entirety of the Romhack, is resource management. Your resources are stretched pretty thinly for much of the game, and you really do have to pick and choose which items you prioritize purchasing, and which items you forego because you only get so much money. And that's great. It really helps set the tone of the hack's plots, which effectively involves a bunch of mercenaries and misfits barely scraping through their journey. In my experience, this helps contextualize the Fire Emblem experience into something unique. The series has always been about overcoming impossible odds and being outmatched in every way by the enemy, and the Dragon Herald nails this by making the plot actually match that asymmetry in the gameplay. Another aspect of resource management occurs when making certain choices. In 7X, you get one of 3 unique items depending on who you choose to deploy. 2 of those items are the silver card and the member card, so you have to choose whether you want a larger quantity of cheap but common items from the vendor and armory, or more expensive but more unique items from secret shops. I chose the silver card myself, but I do wonder what my experience would have been like if I had chosen the member card, and I intend to play through the hack a second time on my own while making that choice. A final aspect of resource management is deciding whether to train Filch, the thief. She needs more than a few speed growths to be able to nab every stealable item in the game, and you miss out on a couple of key goodies if you don't feed her a couple of kills here and there, and maybe give her a valuable promotion down the line. But then you've trained up a thief to steal key items instead of an actual combat unit that could probably contribute more to battles. It's very much a trade-off, and an interesting one at that. One that's probably more rewarding in a second playthrough, once you know what you're potentially missing out on. As far as map design goes, I don't personally have a lot of high demands here. As long as a map gives you important stuff to do from turn 1 and feels reasonably fair, I'm not going to have many complaints about it. That said, the Dragon Herald's maps are generally pretty well designed and tend to play pretty quickly turn-wise. When I record Let's Play episodes, I tend to find that talking through decisions tends to massively increase an episode's length, so the length of the series probably isn't a good measure of how long it takes to get through the game yourself. I think if you're playing by yourself, it would take about 8 to 12 hours to get through the entirety of the Dragon Herald, if you're reasonably familiar with Fire Emblem games, at least for your first run. As I started to play through the first few chapters of the Romhack, I thought the map design was pretty good, but it got better and better as I continued to progress through the game, and in retrospect, earlier maps in the hack tend to look a little plain or feel a little straightforward. Looking back on it all now that I'm done with the Dragon Herald, it's pretty clear that Big Mood was learning as he went, designing progressively better maps with the same Romhack, and that makes me more excited than ever to see if he takes on any future projects. The mid-games chapters are probably among the hardest in the game, with Chapter 12 probably being the chapter I struggle with the most to complete within a reasonable term limit, for full recruitment purposes. But a lot of the Dragon Herald's difficulty is ultimately optional. If you're willing to forego a few extras and cut a few corners, you can definitely make things easier on yourself, but you will probably lose out on a few items or characters that aren't strictly needed, but could be very useful in the right circumstances. But you won't need those things as badly if you spend more time on maps, because your characters will be of a higher level from killing more enemies. So it's a kind of a trade-off. One stumbling block for a lot of people who tried the Romhack is Chapter 10. Basically, it's a chapter where you only have 2 force-deployed units and no one else, and you're fighting against a vastly stronger enemy. Your only real hope of getting through requires an intermediate understanding of GBA enemy AI, and how it can change when you move your units into certain established zones. The dialogue at the beginning of the chapter hints at this challenge, but I feel like nothing can really prepare you for all of Chapter 10's surprises, outside of playing the map a few times for practice. And it feels a little bit less tested than other maps do with all the things that can go wrong here. But the chapter as a concept is a pretty cool idea. I can appreciate the willingness to experiment, but I think it's worth tweaking a bit in order to make the Romhack a little more widely accessible to people. Fortunately, Big Mood has already made some tweaks since watching me play through the chapter, and it feels a lot more playable upon a quick second playthrough. A couple of other maps stand out as being a little bit rough around the edges, mostly due to highly demanding reinforcements in those chapters, or odd pacing when it comes to giving your unit something to do on certain turns, but there's nothing around for them that they can safely handle. Chapters 12 and 15 come to mind the most for me. They are epic battles, as denoted by the special musical attention that they get, but they are also filled with reinforcements that are hard to keep up with. Some crucial resources like healing staves and high-quality weapons get stretched pretty thin throughout the hack, so it's somewhat important to play efficiently and reasonably quickly. But if your army can't kill enemy reinforcements off, possibly because of shaky hit rates, or possibly because of being 1 or 2 points short on power or speed, then you will eventually get overwhelmed. I appreciate the willingness to experiment with creating unique scenarios for the player to get through, but it does occasionally feel like you're relying on luck more than anything to scrape by in those chapters sometimes. That said, there are maps that really stand out in this hack as being among the most fun and unique challenges I experienced in a Fire Emblem game, sealing this hack's position as one of my favorite Romhacks I've ever played. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these experiences boil down to taking something familiar to a Fire Emblem player and adding on just a little twist. Take Chapter 14, for example. I went into it thinking it was going to be a simple route map until I put a unit on the only bridge over the river that cuts the initial deployment area from the rest of the map, and then I put another unit on that bridge. And when the bridge finally collapsed as a result of my terrible curiosity, I suddenly had to form a new strategy with my army split and got through it in the end. It was really fun and also unlike anything I've ever played in a Fire Emblem game. My other favorite maps in this ROM hack include Chapters 5, 13, 17, 18, and the finale. Chapter 5 features a bandit attack led by a rival tactician named Blap, who announces his new strategies and forces you to adjust your movement in kind if you want to keep a potential new recruit in his village safe. Chapter 13 is a mission where character deployment is very much spread out, in a fog of war map that is also a race against time. Chapter 17 is another race against time, this time to escape enemy forces on your tail. Chapter 18 splits your party in two around a temple to retake its throne. Oh yeah, and the main lord stands alone in the middle of it all, surrounded by enemies. And the finale is, well, the finale. No spoilers here, but it's a complex chapter that is suitably tense for a final battle, and it's very challenging as well. Big Moo does a really good job introducing his expectations very lightly early on, and then maps continue to vary along these sets of expectations, growing more complex over time. Generally speaking, you're rewarded for playing reasonably quickly, as this helps with not burning through your heavily limited resources, and you probably want to establish a core team of units that you'll use in every chapter, so that you can keep up with enemy strength growth throughout the game's 23 chapters. Next, I'd like to discuss the Dragon Herald's narrative. Whenever I play a Fire Emblem game for the first time, or if I haven't played it in a while, I do what a lot of people probably do. I read as much as I can. There's something to be said for how gameplay and story meld in Fire Emblem, and while I feel like the story is sometimes held back by the fact that it's in a video game and has to be abbreviated to some extent in order to cut to the chase and let the player play again, overall, Fire Emblem games usually offer pretty good stories in comparison to other video game series. So before I started playing the Dragon Herald, I was excited to get a first impression of the story. Usually with video games, and especially with Fire Emblem, it's the first impression that cues me into whether the story I'm reading will be good or not so good. And there are very few instances where I played a game or started reading a book and got an impression that a story would be bad at first and then came around to liking the story in the end. It just doesn't happen for me. So I was pleased when the Dragon Herald gave me a good feeling about the story from the very beginning. The detail in the writing, in giving characters unique voices and ways of speaking, and the overall pacing of the main cutscenes started off well and only got better over time. I can't point to a single major part of the story that felt extraneous or jarring, like I can with some professionally produced games I've played. The twists in the overall structure of the plot all make sense, and nothing feels thrown in as if it's just there to pad out the game's length. With respect to world building, the writing is solid. The game uses the tried and true Fire Emblem method of establishing a continent, Orcia in this case, with a few nations that have previously been in conflict in the past. The militaristic empire of Rodel, the magic-focused kingdom of Folga, and the religious authority Various. But the similarities to other Fire Emblem games practically end there. There is much more to this world than Empire bad, unlike in some other Fire Emblem games, and I will get into that later. I do wish there were more conversations with NPCs in houses and villages than what's present in the early game. However, that's more than made up for with conversations between chapters that help flesh out the world, the people in power over it, and those who stray a little too close to madness in acquiring power for themselves. There's a couple of minor plot points that are slightly jarring, like how there's a canonical 3-month time skip in the mid-game that doesn't actually seem to affect anything in terms of gameplay, but does feature characters canonically leaving and coming back between the same 2 chapters. It's not a big deal, it just struck me as potentially unnecessary in retrospect when it could have been possible to keep the cast together during that point in the story. But that incredibly minor nitpick is the most critical thing I can say about the plot, which is a pretty good sign, at least to me, that the plot is well written and coherent overall. The plot kept me hooked. Big Mood really kept up the tone of the story well, and the pacing is good. As far as characterization goes, as is pretty standard for Fire Emblem, the characters in the spotlight get the most main plot development, whereas other characters largely have their development in support conversations, with a couple of key exceptions where the entire cast of characters gets the chance to talk in main plot scenes. Provided that they're still alive, of course. I didn't get a lot of support conversations during my Let's Play, but I did go into the extras and read the supports unlocked between characters, since they're all unlocked from the moment you add the Romhack's patch. Some of the supports I'm showing on screen are some of the ones I had the most fun reading through, but overall the supports between characters are well written. Nothing stuck out as being jarring, unfitting to the character's personality, completely contrary to the game's tone, or offensive to any reasonable sensibilities. Given that support conversations on average tend to have a lighter tone than the main plot of Fire Emblem games that actually have support conversations, these conversations are written really well. Big Mood put a lot of heart into fleshing out his characters, and it does show. Without getting into too many spoilers for a review dedicated to getting people to play a game for the first time, it's worth noting that the main theme of the hack's narrative is topical and interesting. That theme is the effects that political corruption can have on a religious institution, or in other words, examining the natural conclusions of combining secular power with religious or moral influence. There are plenty of historical and modern examples of this sort of occurrence in the course of the real world's history, which are often destructive to human life or threaten the advancement of societies with anti-intellectual sentiments. That said, the fact that the plot does a good job of exploring this particular phenomenon and competently condemning it rather than leaving it open-ended as to whether this phenomenon is a good or a bad thing really deepens the story and demonstrates great effort on Big Mood's part when it comes to the game's writing. I might have to make a separate video on exploring the story's themes and characterization in the distant future, since that's a fair bit out of the scope of a spoiler-free review, and I'd like to see more people play the Romhack before I just spoil everything about it. But it suffices to say that I prefer this style of storytelling where things are happening throughout the world than the character drama that some other Fire Emblem games become. Although both ways of storytelling are absolutely valid and can happen at the same time, when it comes to exploring societal themes, telling an overarching story is much more impactful than a strictly personal one. Before I conclude the video, I want to talk about the overall presentation of the Dragon Herald. There are a few minor rough patches in how the hack looks with some minor graphical glitches, particularly with Mute's portrait during character conversations, and how Laguna's portrait in the stat screen has some weird glitchy things on the sides. But my somewhat limited understanding of adding custom portraits tells me that things can be a bit finicky in this regard, so I give it a pass. Overall, the portraits look great. Here are some of my favorites. And the custom resources used throughout the hack add a nice touch, contributing to a unique Fire Emblem experience while still feeling like they'd be part of an official Fire Emblem game. It's noteworthy that community resources were used so extensively, considering that the objective of the Romhack was to show what anyone can do with how far the Romhacking community has come. But it's also noteworthy that these resources weren't chosen at random, rather, characters look the way they should, considering their background. Yo, for example, is interested in advancing peace and making sure others can lead fulfilling lives. And as such, her appearance is humble, focusing on function over form. Taiga's appearance meshes well with the idea of an older person in a profession where many die young. He's a mercenary who's done fairly well for himself over the years, and he's starting to take things slow. Other characters look like they should based on their background as well. I won't get too spoilery here, but it's worth drawing attention to detail when it's due. For the most part, the Dragon Herald uses the default music found in the Sacred Stones. And while it's not my favorite soundtrack among all the Fire Emblem games, it's still really good and does a fine job helping set its own tone. It fits reasonably well into the Dragon Herald too. When the default soundtrack doesn't suffice, the creator took the time to add a few pieces of music from other games, mainly for a few of the special and particularly difficult battles throughout the game. I actually like this approach a lot. The Fire Emblem soundtrack does a great job of being entertaining without being distracting, which is important in a strategy game that requires a certain level of being able to hear yourself think that poorly imported or mismatched music would hinder. Big Mood knew how to fold music into the entirety of the player's experience, and it shows in his decision to make custom music stand out and retain a high quality. No game is perfect, and no Fire Emblem game is perfect, but as a Romhack, the Dragon Herald comes closer to perfection than many, presenting fun gameplay as well as a narrative that surpasses some of the official games in some ways. Despite some minor extraneousness in its main plot and a few rough edges in its gameplay, it's a solid Romhack that I would recommend to anyone looking for an entertaining narrative and a challenge to go along with it. It's an excellent fan-made game and an impressive homage to the Romhacking community's dedication to their shared hobby over the years, and it's become one of my favorite Romhacks. I would heartily recommend the Dragon Herald to anyone looking for a new Fire Emblem experience, and strongly encourage anyone interested in trying out Romhacks and fan games to play it. The only caveat that I would mention is that you should try and be patient with some of the game's rougher spots. They exist, but considering the standard to which I would hold a fan game developed as a hobby, and a first release at that, I can't adequately express how far above and beyond the Dragon Herald goes to limit those rough spots. It's a good experience overall, and it's worth your time to play. That's it for this video. It was really a blast playing this game, and I can't wait to revisit it for a challenge playthrough, and I'll definitely play anything else Big Mood puts out in the future. If you like this video or learned something from it, leave a like and subscribe to my channel. It's nice to know that these sorts of reviews are helping point people to things they could try out themselves. Leave a comment if you have anything you'd like to say. I read any comments I get, so feel free to agree or disagree. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.